Hello and welcome back to another edition of Press Pass on GNAT-TV. I'm Andrew McKeever, the news director at GNAT-TV's News Project, and it's a pleasure to have you with us today on Monday, September 21st. It's also a great pleasure to be joined by two distinguished reporters from VTDigger. Kit Norton and Xander Landen cover the State House like a wet blanket for VTDigger, and really pleased to have them with us today to bring us up to speed on what's been going on at remotely at the State House, I guess is the way to put it. The legislature is in its final week of a special September session. The regular session, of course, interrupted by the COVID pandemic. Now they're trying to finish up work on the state budget and a few other items that, are all pretty interesting, and we'll hope to get to as many of them as we can today. But I just thought we could start off with sort of the nuts and bolts, Xander, and have you bring us up to speed on where the state budget stands. It looks like the governor and the legislature are more or less in agreement on what's going to be in that, although I guess there's a few areas of non-agreement so far.
Yeah, I would say definitely a lot more agreement than disagreement. And I think this sort of comes from the fact that the governor was able to propose a budget back in August that really didn't rely on any having to cut much spending. Even a few months ago, there was a lot of worry that tax revenues, because of COVID-19, were going to be tanking, and that there would be the need to cut from a lot of different government programs to save money or to basically balance the budget. And luckily, back in July, when people were filing their taxes, turns out that there was a lot more tax money coming in than economists and analysts had been expecting, because 2019 was a very good year for the economy. So the state got a lot of money that it wasn't expecting, and that sort of helped cushion the blow a little bit of the tax revenue that we aren't seeing because of COVID-19. So there wasn't as much drama or draconian sort of realities to be faced in this budget. And so, it was easier, I think, for the governor to propose something that lawmakers were going to be able to get on board with. And lawmakers have changed a lot of, sort of pieces of the budget. The biggest thing, I think, is the funding for state colleges. Obviously, the colleges have been struggling, and there was a proposal back in April to close several campuses, which raised a lot of concern. And at that point, lawmakers said, we want to give you guys the money, referring to the colleges, to help sort of to buy you the time to formulate a restructuring plan. And they called this bridge funding. The governor has, there have been some bridge funding given to the colleges already, but the colleges said that they needed a bunch more. Tens of millions of dollars in additional money. That money wasn't in the budget that the governor proposed, which raised a bunch of concern for Democrats in the State House. So the biggest change is that the Democrats found a way to fund that extra bridge funding for the colleges to get them through the rest of the fiscal year, where they're expecting to face a pretty large budget deficit. Another interesting thing in the budget is the governor had proposed a plan to give stimulus money to people that didn't get it from the federal government back in April because of their immigration status. So a lot of undocumented immigrants, for example, in Vermont, about 3,000 didn't receive any sort of stimulus. When the government cut checks, everyone a $1,200 check. There were some people that didn't get that, and a lot of those people were undocumented immigrants.
Well, so basically then it sounds like they're pretty close to agreement, and it comes to what, $7.15 billion in the budget altogether?
Yeah. So the budget in total is $7.15 billion, which is a lot more than a normal budget would be. Usually the budget is around $6 billion. Yeah. And that's because the state got a lot of money from the federal government back in April to sort of deal with COVID. They got about $1.25 billion that's been sort of added in to various initiatives. A lot of it's gone to businesses that have been struggling because of the pandemic. A lot of it's gone to healthcare providers that have been, not seeing as many patients and have lost revenue because of the pandemic. So that's money that's been doled out. It's in this budget. And there wasn't much left to deal with when lawmakers got back in August. That basically most of it had already been spent at that point. But there's more of that in here, and a lot of it's going actually to help the school districts that are reopening deal with expenses that they have incurred. Things like having to buy PPE to improve their HVAC systems to make sure that the air quality is safe for students, et cetera. So that's something also that the governor didn't put in the budget that lawmakers wanted to prioritize money for schools that are opening up.
So it sounds like they're all basically on the same page as far as that goes. But the legislature and the governor are definitely not on the same page when it comes to the Global Warming Solutions Act. And Kit, you've been covering this story now for a while. Last week, a lot of activity around this. The legislature, both houses of the legislature passed it. The governor vetoed it. Then the House overrode the governor's veto by more than a 2/3 majority. Now goes to the Senate, where I guess a vote is expected tomorrow on Tuesday, the 22nd. And sounds like a slam dunk that the Senate's going to vote to override the veto as well.
Yeah, there's very little question that the Senate plans to override the veto. They had the numbers when they first voted on this back in June, and so it's pretty much a foregone conclusion that they will override the governor's veto. And it's important to really remember that this has been a Democratic leadership priority for this session to get this proposal done. And what it does is it sets emission goals for the state to meet. And if they do not meet it, if the state fails to meet those goals, there is a liability aspect in which the government could be sued by an individual. And that's been the crux of the issue for the Scott administration and the governor. And so that's where he's been really coming down and saying, I don't feel comfortable about this. And there's also a question of what he says in his veto message, as well as what members of the GOP in the House have said in terms of the constitutionality of setting up a climate council, which is in the legislation, to come up with a plan for greenhouse gas emission reductions. So those are the two main issues that he's had with this bill. However, Democrats say that, one, there's no constitutionality issue. It does not abdicate the role of the legislature, and that the enforcement aspect of this with the part of the bill where an individual could bring a lawsuit against the state is important because it gives it teeth to really make sure that the state follows through on these goals to be met. So this is the kind of back and forth we're seeing, but starting off again, it is a slam dunk. The Senate will indeed override the veto this week, and that it will go into law.
So those climate emission goals sound pretty ambitious at first blush. I mean, they want to get to 20% below the 2005 levels or something like that by 2025. And yet, since 1990, I guess our carbon emissions have gone up 16%. I guess, are those goals realistic, do you think, that they can be reached within the space of, 4 or 5 years?
Well, I mean, that kind of remains to be seen, and I think Xander's also followed this kind of would agree. But but the plan around this legislation was very much aspirational, and lawmakers have said this, but it came more of a need felt by Democrats to address climate change and really the calls for climate action that have circulated across the country, across the world, and in the state over the last year and a half here to take drastic action. So yes, I think there's a understanding that these are high goals, high aspirations, but that it needed to be codified in order to really make it clear that the state is committed to trying to get this under control.
Again, just to kind of stay with what's been happening in the legislature, I guess last week the House and the Senate finally came to an agreement on a cannabis reform bill, which has been kicking around the legislature now for 2 or 3 years at least. And of course, one of our local state senators down here, Dick Sears from Bennington County, has been one of the driving forces behind getting that bill through. What does this new or final compromise version entail? I know the governor had a big concern about saliva testing. That was one issue that kind of held things up for a while. Has that been resolved?
It has been resolved. The Senate had been pretty opposed to saliva testing for a long time. They've rejected this in previous versions of this legislation over concerns, really civil liberties concerns and concerns about the technology of saliva testing. And that's because saliva testing can detect whether the presence of a drug, or in this case, cannabis, is in your system, but it can actually determine whether you're impaired, whether a person is impaired at the time that the test is administered. And so something, a drug like cannabis can remain in a user's system for weeks at a time. So the concern is police have the ability to use these tests and they detect a positive. Well, how do you know the person was impaired at the time they were driving? So that concern has driven opposition in the Senate and from some in the House as well, though the House in general has been more open to saliva testing. The governor has wanted this, arguing that, if we're going to legalize cannabis sales, we need to have bolstered roadway safety measures in place. And this is sort of the key measure that he wants to see. So the House had passed a bill with saliva testing as long as police first obtain a warrant to use it. The Senate had been generally opposed to even saliva testing with warrants, although the warrant provision allowed some people to warm up. And in the final negotiations, the Senate did agree to have saliva testing legalized for police officers to use in this bill. Another big provision is that the Senate also agreed with the House. The House had wanted an opt-in provision for towns where dispensaries are going to be opening up. And basically what that means is that the town would need to affirmatively vote to allow or to welcome dispensaries before they can set up shop. The Senate had wanted dispensaries to be able to set up anywhere without sort of a local vote beforehand. But the governor and the House had wanted an opt-in provision. So that's also in the bill. And the overall, there was some debating about the tax structure. What would the taxes for marijuana look like, and how would sort of municipalities benefit from this, and where would the money go? And so the tax rate it's a combined 20% tax rate. A lot of the money, about 30% of the excise portion of the tax, would go to fund basically drug use prevention and education initiatives, which is another thing the governor has wanted to see in a bill. So the governor got a lot of what he's sort of asked for, and a lot of Republicans, that support the bill and some that don't, have said, the legislature's really gone out of its way to meet him halfway, or maybe even a little bit beyond that. And the governor on Friday indicated that he thinks that the legislature has addressed a lot of his concerns with the bill. So I think it's pretty likely that this will become law in the coming days. But we'll see. I mean, there's always the chance that, he might, after looking at the legislation and thinking about it, change his mind, veto the bill, in which case the bill would likely be dead for the foreseeable future for, until at least next session, because there are not the votes in the House to override a veto, unlike the Global Warming Solutions Act.
So, assuming that doesn't happen, and the bill sails through the rest of the way, Governor signs it, how soon will that become effective? And next year, 2 years from now?
I think we'd be looking at the very earliest dispensaries opening up in May of 2022. So a couple of years, and it could be even longer than that. There are a lot of, there's a lot that would have to take place between now and then. You'd have to have licensing, you'd have to have businesses ready, sort of in the wings, ready to go for that to happen. So, I think I forget the date, but the existing medical marijuana dispensaries under this bill would have the ability to start selling product to consumers before then. So there actually may be some sales sort of taking place sooner than that, but sort of at the very earliest for businesses to start opening up new businesses, probably in 2022.
That opt-in, opt-out provision is going to be kind of interesting to see which communities. I think there are some that have already indicated that they don't want it. I believe the town of Manchester, for instance, down here passed a provision, sort of speaking to that a little bit a couple of years ago, and it'll be interesting to see which communities opt in and wish say no thank you. Well, let's move over to Act 250, which is another one of these long-running sagas in the legislature now. The revision of the bill that originally passed in 1970. I was in college at the time, and I remember when that happened, just to show you how long ago that was. But they've been working on a revision now for a couple of years, and just seem to be totally stuck and unable to kind of, find an agreement. And now I confess I'm having a hard time keeping track of what they've come up with. It seems like they've come up with a very scaled down, watered down version that just deals with what, recreation trails? What's the story here?
This again, you're spot on. This started off as about 50-page bill, and that was kind of the culmination of 2.5 years of, they'd created a study and a committee, well, not a committee, a commission really, to look at this and decide how this land use law should potentially change. And so then this, again, 50-page bill passed the House back in, I believe it was back in February, and this had myriad tweaks and changes to the current law. It got over to the Senate side, and then COVID hit, and so this was the plan, was to start working on this big bill throughout the end of the session, as it was then thought. However, then COVID hit, kind of everything went off the rails, and so when they came back here for this kind of quick strike COVID budget session, the plan was to, okay, let's try to get something done on Act 250 reform. And so then after trying to go through the bill, they decided to basically cut out everything that there wasn't enough clarity on, and that they weren't sure about. And so now that the bill that passed the Senate, it's a 10-page bill, and what it does is it does two things specifically. It looks at recreational trails, and it kind of stipulates that trails that are in the process of being created, or that individual parties that are looking to create trails, they can continue to operate through the end of 2021 without an Act 250 review, this is different than currently what the law mandates. And then it also sets up some language that would set up, so thinking about how best to manage trails in the coming years. And then the other aspect of it deals with making sure that forests and habitats are not broken up by developments. And so it creates a sub-criteria that will look at studying how a development that goes under Act 250 review impacts forest fragmentation, and impacts the habitat. So that's a new sub-criteria. And that is the aspect which, even that was controversial. Well, controversial might be a little strong word, but it brought some conversation in the Senate. And in fact, when it was on the Senate floor for discussion, they decided to break those two questions up, and unanimously supported the recreational trails aspect, because that's, again, very, everyone agrees that that's a good idea. But in terms of deciding whether to look at forest fragmentation and how development deals with that, and creating a sub-criteria under the law to look into this issue, there were a few of the Senate Republicans and some of the more moderate Senate Democrats who had concerns about what that would mean in terms of folks who are doing subdivisions on their land, and other aspects of how this might impact possible development. So that's all the bill does now. There's no language around, water quality or other issues. It's a very straightforward piece of legislation now that deals with these two aspects, which the Senate thought, okay, this is what we can get done, let's do it. And then it remains to be seen, kind of, on the House side, because now the Senate's passed this, now it goes back to the House, whether they're going to move on it this week. They're running out of time. If they agree, if they don't disagree, so it still remains in flux. So who knows? We may actually not even see this change pass before they adjourn for the year. But hope springs eternal for Democrats and their Act 250 reform.
So this, is there any sense that let's assume that the bill does pass, the governor signs it, etc. I mean, are they planning to revisit some of the other issues around Act 250 about how it's cumbersome, it's anti-development, it doesn't address some of the downtown and village development questions that were part of the discussion earlier, or are we going to see sort of an Act 2 on the revision of Act 250 at some point next year?
Right. So the plan is to go back and get into those really meaty issues next year, starting in January 2021, kind of come back and really get into that and try to get something meaningful done in the next biennium. And ironically, this is something that the Scott administration has a problem with. This kind of pared down bill is the administration's thinking on it is that why even bother doing this? It doesn't have any of the really meaningful reform that we'd like to see. So what's the point? And so that's one of the feelings. And of course, the Senate Democrats' feeling is that, well, we've been working so hard on this. We know that these are good proposals, so let's move forward. But yes, the plan is to come back and kind of take up the really more difficult issues that they weren't able to find consensus on during this kind of bizarre short budget that they're in, and try to hammer out the details on that in the coming session.
Interesting. Well, it's certainly been an interesting couple of weeks up there in Montpelier. We're normally kind of a dull moment in the legislative calendar, but we have a couple of minutes left, and I just wanted to kind of get both of you to weigh in here on how you saw the politics of all of this playing out. We have this little election coming up in November, and of course there's a national election weighing on things, and then here we have the two main statewide races. I mean, there were others for Secretary of State and State Treasurer and a few other offices. But the governor and lieutenant governor races are the two most prominent ones. I mean, conventional wisdom seems to be on the governor's race that it's Phil Scott's race to lose. Well, every poll I've seen shows him with a pretty wide margin. But the lieutenant governor's race is sort of provided a little more intrigue. And I guess I was just wondering what your sense is of how that competition between newcomer Molly Gray and Scott Milne, who almost became governor in 2014, might play out.
Yeah, it's going to be very interesting. There's a lot of enthusiasm, I think, for Molly Gray's candidacy. She was able to win, beating several incumbents, Democratic incumbents running also for that position, including Senate Leader Tim Ash. So she out the gate was very so there was a lot of momentum behind her campaign. A lot of people in the Democratic establishment were endorsing her, back in February when she announced she was going to run. It'll be very interesting to see the competition, and it's already been pretty interesting. I think today, actually, we're going to see Scott Milne headed to a press conference in about 15, 20 minutes. And at that event, Senator Debbie Ingram, Democrat who ran for lieutenant governor, is actually going to be endorsing Scott Milne. Hope to hear more about why she's deciding that later, but it is the race is definitely on. Scott Milne released a proposal, his sort of policies that he would sort of push for if he was lieutenant governor last week, and a lot of it is sort of mirroring Governor Phil Scott's proposals from over the years, sort of touting sort of affordability, lowering taxes, tax incentives. In general, I would say that Scott Milne his approach to campaigning is sort of aligning himself with Phil Scott, and that sort of that's a lot of his the sort of classic Vermont Republican ideas and policies, and sort of saying that he will be an ally to the governor if he's lieutenant governor, sort of alluding to the fact that the current lieutenant governor, David Zuckerman, is a progressive Democrat who does not, share a lot of the same views as Phil Scott. And he's saying, if I'm lieutenant governor, I'm actually going to get to work with the governor on issues and sort of help him advance his agenda in the legislature, et cetera. So, it's going to be, it's been an interesting campaign, and it will continue to be one. I think, maybe, the fact that, David Zuckerman is an incumbent Democrat, or the current office holder is a Democrat. Maybe that will give Molly Gray an edge. I'm not sure. But she definitely performed very well in the first primary election. Scott Millen has also performed very well in previous elections, as you said, almost beat Shumlin in his last election. So it'll be a very interesting race.
And before I forget to mention, VTDigger will be having two live forums with the two leading candidates in both races, the governor's race and the lieutenant governor's race coming up. I mean, that's a thought I've had also, that they're probably, since my guess is Phil Scott will gather a lot of Democratic votes for the governorship, that a lot of those Democratic voters may wish to assuage their guilt by voting for Molly Gray for lieutenant governor. That's one theory, although many of my theories don't turn out to be quite as accurate as I thought they might have been. But I'm intrigued. I know we just have a minute or two left, but the fact that Senator Ingram is going to be endorsing Scott Millen, and that was a very hard-fought primary in the Democrats for the lieutenant governor race. I'm sure going into it, Tim Ash was the odds-on favorite, and a lot of people were surprised by the fact that he lost, and the fact that he lost by a fairly substantial margin. Is there sort of still some lingering bad blood going around there amidst those candidates, or are they all sort of mending fences or whatever in the wake of the primary?
Sure, I'll take that one. Well, on the face of it, they would say no. It was just a day or two, I believe, after the primary, the Democratic Party held what they called their unity rally, which was outside the State House, which was very much a kumbaya moment. All the candidates were there, basically saying we stand behind Zuckerman and Gray, and then all the other statewide candidates that also won. So on the face of it, they would say, which I should also point out, actually, Debbie Ingram was also there, which now, of course, we see her deciding to endorse Millen. So on the face of it, yes, they are all in sync. However, it was a contentious campaign. There were different campaigns were feeding the press stories about other candidates, which is part of the game, but that was happening. And looking at some of the rhetoric coming from other candidates, and you saw that this in debates, there was a feeling about Gray's how qualified she is for the job, and the potential where some of these established politicians in the state felt that she hadn't put in the time necessary to be running for this position. Whether you agree with that sentiment or not is a different matter. But there was definitely that sentiment, and folks were very vocal about that idea. So now that she's the nominee, has that all gone away, or is there still murmurings? It appears with Debbie Ingram coming out in support of Milne, who also has not ever held a public office, it must be noted, that might still be going on.
Oh, interesting. Well, it's never ending. Anyway, I know you guys both have to be off to cover the next story here, so I wanted to just say thank you both very much for making the time today to be with us, to bring us up to date on what's been happening virtually in Montpelier, and I'm sure we'll have you back again real soon. Kit Norton and Xander Landen of VTDigger, really a pleasure to have you both on the show today. Have a great day, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thanks for having us.